This is the best of First and Last, the podcast.
Guys, listen, I'm going to give everyone a little bit of a tip right here because I feel like right now the NBA needs this. So if you're feeling a little down, it's the middle of the winter, seasonal depression and things like that kick in when the sun goes away for a long time. And last night I got home and I found one of the surefire ways to beat that is to dig up that pint ice cream you've been keeping in the freezer, get it heated up just right, and then get to that point about midway through the pint where you can do the flip, where you can take the whole content of the package and just flip that over at the top so you get the beautiful soft underbelly of the ice cream that had been lurking at the bottom, and then allow yourself to experience that kind of joy. Allow yourself to experience something that I think could change your mood for the better in all of this. The reason I bring this up, besides the fact that I'm very hungry again now thinking about this, is that the NBA right now seems to be a little ornery. Seems to be a little bit extra going on in everyone, and I don't know if they woke up on the wrong side of the bed because of that same seasonal depression that I talked about, or if it's just that January midpoint of the season where everyone seems to get a little bit cranky. But last night it happened again. So we just got off the heels of talking about everything that happened with the Rockets and the Clippers. We just got off the heels about talking about Kyle Lowry and Ben Simmons running in the tunnel to get after it. And now last night, we had Aaron Aflalo and Nemanja Bjelica. We're going to call him Belly for the rest of this because it took a lot of Googling to make sure I pronounce that name right in all of this. Involved in a scuffle. And when I say this seems unfair to Belly because his role in this was really subduing Aaron Aflalo, who last night was ejected during the Magic game. During the game. Here, listen to this sound here.
Crawford into the corner. Working there on a Wandu. He pulls up on the jumper from 22. It's no good. And a rebound. Oh, and a fight inside as Belly and Aflalo are going at it. Belly's got Aaron Aflalo in a headlock. Aflalo finally backs out of that. Boy, both those guys are going to be gone. There's no question about that. Let's look at the replay here. Belly's starting to crash in from up top. Oh, he just kind of rushes into Aflalo. Whoa, a wild swing by Aflalo. Holy cow. I mean, that's a full-on swing. Hello, suspension to Aaron Aflalo.
Hello, suspension seems to be the popular tune right now, as we've heard plenty of from Woj coming off of the breach of the Clippers locker room that indicates that the NBA is doing their due diligence right now and getting ready to name plenty of names in suspension as this goes onward. But you look at that particular instance last night, and it really was Aflalo was fed up, throwing a haymaker that you can't believe missed. And as someone who used to watch a lot of Mike Tyson's greatest hits the night before games, you were always wowed at the punches that just missed, the uppercuts and the things that Mike would throw with so much power that you go, if that connected, we're talking about maybe losing your entire head in the process. And with Aaron Aflalo here, it seemed like that same situation, so you could hardly fault Belly on the other side of this for just trying to keep the guy from hitting him anymore, and yet he was also ejected in all this, something that, talking about after the game, he really tried to distance himself from.
First of all, I don't want to feel like I'm a victim here. I mean, that's everything part of the game, but he took a swing on me, and I was just trying, to protect myself first of all, and to help him. I mean, to calm him down, because he was wild. I don't know what's wrong with that guy, but and at that point, I mean, if you attack me like that, I just have to protect myself or my family, and everybody who knows me, they know I'm like calm guy.
First and Last, Mike Golic Jr. here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app, and so this situation, a little more isolated, as just two guys, one of whom on the court lost his cool. The other, when you hear Belly talk there, about as even-keeled as it comes. So hardly seems like the guy who is as gassed up about this as maybe Aaron Aflalo was. But again, this string of a few days right here has become sort of normalized in the NBA. And it's weird to look at this and decide how we're supposed to react, because all the time when I sit around and listen to basketball fans talk, this is the level of agitation and the level of back and forth that basketball fans for so long seem to clamor for. The basketball fans that grew up in the 80s and 90s. We spent all yesterday on Golic and Wingo. I spent listening to Dad and Trey talk about all of the different guys from that era that were just these larger-than-life figures and that who would swing at the drop of a hat and you recognized as these amazing tough guys through all of this. And yet now, I heard an interesting cut from Stephen A. on his show yesterday talking about how this is perceived in this current day and age.
One thing is clear. Regardless of what level of affection or lack thereof Chris Paul may have had for Austin Rivers, for Blake Griffin, for Doc Rivers, you cannot find yourself in this kind of situation. It just looks bad. And I'm going to say it again. It's the Colin Kaepernick era. Fair or not, because of an issue that has been hijacked. You have folks out there looking at the modern day black athlete, viewing them as unappreciative, ungrateful, and too willing to buck the system instead of going out there and performing. And they're looking for an excuse to turn against you, which the NFL and its troubles have shown. It may not be fair. I damn sure don't think it is, nor do I think it's right. But it's reality. And forgive me if I expected one of the most intelligent and upstanding athletes I've ever encountered, named Chris Paul, to get that better than anybody. He does. He just lost his way last night.
First and last of Mike Golic Jr. here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. And when I was over sitting with Dad and Trey yesterday on Golic and Wingo, I said, a lot of the way that this is perceived and a lot of the way that fighting now is perceived has to do with, or I should say, our willingness and the willingness of athletes to engage in it is the way perception is. I think we do a bad job of receiving these things because, to Stephen A. Smith's point, in a majority African-American league, you hear that word thug get thrown around a lot when stuff like this happens. In a post-Malice in the Palace world where the NBA decided we've got to clean up our act because fans are starting to perceive this a certain way, there is that disconnect of sort of holding up and exalting what you saw from 80s and 90s NBA as something that you covet, while at the same time turning around and demonizing what players do currently. It sends a mixed message that's uncomfortable and, again, puts the blame squarely on the shoulders of the people consuming the product for the reason that you're not getting what you claim you want. If you want this physical brand of basketball, if you want guys to play with that passion that sometimes spills over and becomes a little bit more, you've got to show you're capable of handling that on the back end without using those racial buzzwords that are going to de-incentivize guys from acting anywhere close to that are probably going to have guys reserved, listen, in a way that we should all be more comfortable with in general. I'm not saying that every night should turn into a slugfest. I'm not saying anything like that. It's more of the sport of basketball when you can remove that stuff. And I think that was at the heart of a lot of the NBA's move with this as well, of saying it doesn't look like basketball when you've got guys just going in and muddying up the lane with physicality, muddying up the lane with big-time fouls. You get a lot more of the skill on display without that. But at the same time, if you're a fan base that's going to laud the passion and the toughness and the want-to of the guys in yesteryear, but then turn around when instances pop up now and create an environment the likes of which Stephen A. just described, well, then you're rowing in opposite directions, and none of those directions are really fair to play a group of players that then can't win, because if they're not displaying this kind of passion, then they're not tough enough for you. But the minute they do, all of a sudden it becomes something that you're too uncomfortable to really stomach. So we got to figure it out and distance it and do a better job on the receiving end. Because these guys are going out there and I think playing for the most part. I've never really bought into this idea that players, once they get into the body of the game, are less passionate about playing. Now, it may pop up in certain ways, whether it's with the discussion about the length of the season or the positioning of games on back-to-back and resting players and all these different things. But guys are still competitive and guys still really want to win when you put them out there between the lines.
First and last. The podcast.
Got some tweets coming in on the 1-800-Flowers.com Twitter feed, at ESPN Radio, at Golic Jr. 57. Aaron Phipps tweets in, you draw the line when things spill over to off the court. In the NHL, they can drop their gloves, beat the hell out of each other, and it ends there. Leave it all out in the court. Yeah, I mean, it's been kind of beaten overhead, the sort of racial divide that allows that to be okay and built into the body of the sport and all of that stuff. But in general, I think people understand that you would prefer all of that stuff stay there as opposed to the kind of things that happen. And the reason I'm sure the league is looking so much into what happened between the Clippers and the Rockets because it took place off the court. It seemed to have a bit of premeditation to it as far as a plan that they clearly executed. Remember sending Clint Capella to the front door to be the distraction? So kind of one of those things you got to check in on if you're the NBA. But something we might want to check in on elsewhere in the NBA. It's time for Straight Talk, brought to you by Straight Talk Wireless. Best phones, best networks, no contracts. And we talked the other day, too, about the Cleveland Cavaliers. And I told you guys not to worry because the January Cavs are a known phenomenon and something that pops up every year and something that we just need to do our best to isolate, put off in a box by itself, let it sit, and work itself out. Because it usually does by the time the clock and the calendar turn over to February. Well, there seems to be a growing feeling, not just by people in the media who can't help ourselves and decide to overreact to this constantly every year, but even now in the Cavs locker room, a bit, as our own ESPN Cavaliers reporter Dave McMenamin reported yesterday on Golic and Wingo, there seems to be a growing sense of distrust between players and management in Cleveland.
Because by all indication, the Brooklyn Nets first-round pick the Cavs have in their possession, the front office does not want to part with and hold on to it as sort of a insurance policy should LeBron James part in the summer of 2018 as a free agent.
First and last, Mike Golic Jr. here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app, and this coming on the heels of Dave McMenamin's piece on .com that multiple Cavs players who spoke under the condition of anonymity expressed a belief that the way they're currently playing, the problems plaguing the team, an aging roster, defensively challenged personnel, a glut of redundant role players aren't simply going to be worked out, and that the team doesn't have the capability to fix its problems and get back on a championship track. And again, I feel like we're all missing the point in this. What they've just done is they've changed this up a little bit. And really, for all the people, because I know one of our favorite pastimes in the NBA is to sit around and give LeBron credit for being this master manipulator and all of this. But if you want to go down that road, this just screams LeBron saying, hey, I need someone to take the weight off me this January. Because usually in past Januaries with this Cavs team, it's been LeBron James demanding a playmaker or complaining, very passive-aggressively about Kevin Love fitting out, not fitting in. All these different things that have popped up over the last couple of years that we've seen and registered. So now you've got LeBron James who, in the last couple of nights, even as things have gone poorly for this team, has said things like, quote, I like our effort tonight. If we continue that going into the next few games, I like where we are. He said earlier in the week, quote, I love our potential. LeBron being overwhelmingly positive during a time of year where he's usually a little surly. He's in his 15th year. He's got a lot of reason to, as the physical toll of 7 straight finals appearances now continues to wear down on a guy whose body is not going to get any younger anytime soon. It makes sense to all of a sudden have this bit of strife come from someone else on the team. Now, other people may not have the clout to come out and say things as publicly as LeBron James does. But for him to be able to push this off and have someone else on the team now do a little bit of the dirt and spread the love out a little bit more evenly, keeps us still actively engaged in the Cavaliers and thinking and talking about this team, which we saw when Steph Curry began his rise to prominence. LeBron James still definitely covets. Gets us all reacting and then makes their eventual rise and steadying of the ship all that more decisive when it comes up to it. Now, that theory, as far-fetched as it may be, may just make me feel better about this constant proclamation. My refusal to believe that something is really wrong until I see it manifest itself in a time of year that has any sort of value. Now, if you're looking at reasons to think that this is different, the Cavaliers' record this season against the top 3 teams in either conference is 1-6. They're 0-4 against Golden State, 0-1 against Houston, 0-1 against Minnesota, 0-1 against Toronto, and 1-1 against Boston. So the teams that they would be competing against at the top level, they have not fared overly well. Now, all of those are limited sample size, but when you lump them together as those groups, it becomes a little bit more problematic. Now, we've seen enough from them to where former players, we talked about Tim Legler yesterday and his views on some of the problems. Paul Pierce, who will come up as he steadily approaches his big night in Boston, reflecting on what he believes the real concern with the Cavs is.
I don't know. I think there's some questions there. I mean, with the way Boston looks, with the way Toronto looks, I mean, you really have to be concerned if you're the Cavs. I mean, I know they pressed the button a year ago. Lost one game on their way to the finals, so they are able to press the button once they get there. But they could be bored with the process.
Roster.
But
Different team.
I think there's some concern in there. If they don't get a top 3 seed and they have to see Boston and Toronto to get to the finals, they might be in trouble.
First and last, I'm Mike Golic Jr. here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. And the Cavs' path to the finals is something that came into question last year as they were vying for the 1 seed down the stretch, and ultimately, based on when they decided to rest players, that sort of peak at the end of the season where the Cavs had lost a few games, but they went into a stretch where they were playing, teams like the Pacers and the Magic down the stretch where they were able to get easy wins, and then it all hit that crescendo, which is, again, how the Cavaliers treat every season now with LeBron James getting to the point he is, a crescendo to a point where for them, it was a road game in Boston where they throttled the Celtics and reestablished in their mind the belief that they needed, sort of touch 90, the way guys do before the combine when you're getting ready to run. And they tell you during the week, touch about 90% of that max 40 that you're going to get. That was the Cavs touching that. Then they dialed it back, decided the 1 seed wasn't something they needed to actively pursue, and then coasted to the playoffs where they went back and continued to be the team they were going to be. And so until that stops being the plan, until we stop knowing that that's the way the Cavaliers structured their season, I'm putting my faith in LeBron, even if we're hearing right now that some of the players on the Cavaliers might not have that same faith at this point in time. Straight Talk Wireless, nationwide coverage on America's largest and most dependable 4G LTE network. So ESPN is continuing to try and provoke me into panicking over the Cavs, and it's not going to work, not now, not ever, or at least not until later this spring when we would actually have reason to panic with this.
First and last, the podcast. First and last, the podcast.
Yesterday, reading a lot of the information that's come out about the Michigan sentencing of Dr. Larry Nassar in the case involving child molestation and child pornography and USA Gymnastics, it is one of those days. We talked about the other day all the ways that sports can be great. This is one of those where you recognize the serious problems that can exist in a place where the stakes become so high and winning and success becomes such the priority that a lot of other things get pushed under the rug, and it does nothing but make you sick. And so yesterday, the reason this all gets rehashed and honestly, thankfully, because we're going to talk about certain ways that the exposure of this needs to happen, because as it was pointed out time and time again on my timeline yesterday, this seems like something that we're really just acquainting ourselves with completely for the first time in a way that everyone is publicly acknowledging. But yesterday, victim statements began at Michigan in the sentencing of Dr. Larry Nassar. Prosecutors expect 98 women to speak or submit written statements this week. Nassar, 54, pleaded guilty to 10 counts of first-degree criminal sexual conduct in Lansing, Michigan in November. The Michigan Attorney General's office has asked for 40 to 125 years for his sexual abuse. Nassar has already been sentenced to 60 years in federal prison on child pornography charges. And John Barr, our ESPN investigative reporter, was on SportsCenter with John Anderson talking about day one of the Nassar sentencing.
It was a gut-wrenching day of testimony as victim after victim addressed Nassar. We heard from a former volleyball player at Michigan State who says she tried to alert trainers about Nassar's inappropriate methods in the early 2000s. We heard from a woman through her advocate who went to Meridian Township Police back in 2004, actually filing a police report against Nassar, but that report went nowhere. He was never prosecuted. Emotions were certainly high as victims confronted Nassar.
I must ask you this. Are you remorseful for your actions and all of the lives that you have changed forever?
The most confusing part was that my mother was in the room with us while this happened. He strategically placed himself between us and skillfully obscured what was happening.
And she said, Mom, he put his fingers in me and they weren't gloved. And I said, Chelsea, I was right there in the room. And she goes, you couldn't see what was going on, Mom.
And I have experienced flashback nightmares of the abuse. Nothing will ever take away what you have done to me or to the others that stand behind me. However, we can walk free and radiate the strength that we have gained from your horrific acts, something you will never be able to do.
Perhaps you have figured it out by now, but little girls don't stay little forever. They grow into strong women that return to destroy your world.
The last victim you heard from, her name is Kylie Stevens. She was 6 years old, she says, when Nassar first sexually abused her. 29 victims or their advocates spoke today. The head of USA Gymnastics, Carrie Perry, was in court. I tried to speak with her after the proceeding today. She wouldn't comment, saying she's here for the victims, John.
All right, this is day one. How does the rest of the week play out, John?
Well, there will be a lot more of what we heard today. More than 90 women or their advocates are expected to address the court. We heard from some in the form of written statements. We heard from women who gave videos who actually live overseas. It will be, when it's all said and done, a good chunk of the majority of the more than 150 women who actually have accused him of sexual abuse. And then there's the issue of his sentence. He could get 25 to 40 years, but we know that the Attorney General's office is asking for 125, 1 year for every police report that was filed up until recently, although that number is now at 135.
First and last, Mike Golic Jr. here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. The numbers there he just read are staggering. A year for every police report, 125 police reports fired, over 150 accusers. And those are just the ones that came forward. And those are just the ones in this instance. And that is the terrifying, among the many terrifying and gut-wrenching layers in all this, is that you realize that this cannot possibly be limited to just we're seeing right here. This is what after, and I encourage anyone who hasn't at this point to make sure that they go and read the piece that John Barr and Dan Murphy wrote on ESPN.com talking about the adults that enabled this behavior, and it could not be summed up more succinctly than by the final paragraph of this piece. And it summed up, the culture of enabling is absolutely vital to why pedophiles flourish, Den Hollander said when Nassar pleaded guilty to abusing her and 9 others in November. You don't get someone like Larry Nassar. You don't get a pedophile who is able to abuse without there being a culture surrounding him in that place. Until we deal with enablers, this is going to happen. And this is a guy that abused his privilege as a trainer and as someone who got to work with these young athletes. And in the sport of gymnastics, the time frame where, you know, especially young women come into the height of their skill set, and we see it all the time on the Olympic stage, it is a young sport. And so to abuse his place as an athlete, as a trainer for these athletes and sexually violating these women, and when you read through this story and you see the number of people that looked the other way, either because this is a guy that they believed was trustworthy, that parents had a friendship with, that parents believed was someone that they can trust, especially compared to the other coach discussed in this, who had more of a, was more of a tyrant in the way that he dealt with the kids, that almost turned Nassar into the good cop version of the two. And when you've got kids that are so young that don't know what's going on, and then you've got a guy that seems trustworthy, and people refuse to believe something like that even when they're told by kids as this comes up, this is allowed to flourish. When it gets to the campus of Michigan State and you've got college-age women or kids that are becoming teenagers that are part of the Spartan Youth Program that are reporting this and having it turned away and having it looked the other way, you quickly start to see what can be the worst side of sports and all of these things. And it pops up in a lot of ways that are comparatively lower stakes. But when you're talking about events like this that can alter someone's life forever going forward in ways that they can't fully comprehend when it's going on, you recognize the failures in all the system again when the stakes are so damn high for all this. And we see it where money floods other programs, but in this it can be success, it can be prestige, it can be these the allure of Olympic grandeur, and something that Dr. Nasser was a part of, and something that was part of his allure was his connection with USA Gymnastics and the Olympic team. But when you take all of that and you've got parents and you've got administrators and you've got people that are part of USA Gymnastics and all of these things that are so much more concerned with making sure, and in some cases you see the good intent of parents who want to put their kids in the best position and give them the best things and the best chance to succeed. But when all of this gets so blinded by this pursuit of success and this understanding that success only looks one way in this, and it has to come through a certain way, that at times you numb yourself to the things that you should be hearing and the warning signs that you should be going off. And when it gets to the administrative level, when it becomes a CYA move that seems to, by all accounts in this, be done to protect the name of USA Gymnastics or the name of a certain program or what's going on, you see and you realize the potential for devastation is always lurking there. And until people individually decide to be more accountable to this, and until systems have some way to punish people involved like this, and we saw this same thing happen in Penn State, and this feels eerily similar to the things you hear in Penn State or in Baylor, where people in positions of power that are supposed to be required to report things like this don't. And when you don't, you fail young people involved, and the level of disgust and shame we should all wear because of that is prominent, and it stinks like hell in this. So that was a difficult thing to have to process for everyone, and it should be. It's absolutely what it should be, because until you're forced to confront this reality, none of it gets better. And you hope for all of the young women. Again, when you read 150, that's a staggering number. You hope all of them can at some point through this process find some semblance of peace for something that has to have been a haunting and looming specter in the entirety of their lives since this stuff took place. You again hope they find peace, and not just knowing that there's going to be justice, that this guy is going to be locked away to rot forever, but that some point going forward, everyone else is going to address this in a way that actually produces some meaningful change.
First and last, the podcast.
We're already at the point in the winter season, by the way, if you're the folks in the Northeast, where we've been hit with enough of the good heavy stuff to where you wake up with a light dusting today. And as people who come into the office pretty early in the morning around here, you get that email at night, hey, leave yourself a little extra time. You set the alarm 15, 20 minutes earlier. You get up, you sort of assess the situation. I looked outside and saw the coating this morning, hit snooze a few more times. Because that's one of those, once you've been through the 6 to 12 inch overnight stuff, a little dusting like this, while it may cripple some of our friends in the South, and I have already heard of massive school cancellations in places like Charlotte, God forbid it hits Atlanta again. I don't know if Chipper Jones has enough gas in the ATV to go save that many people again, but at the very least right now, if you're in the Northeast, we got this one, guys. But if you need to, the fine people at 1-800-Flowers got you covered. We will see if the answers are as easy to come by, and judging by my sound sheet, I don't know if they are, for the Steelers and Saints going into this offseason. So both teams fresh off a disappointing divisional round. The Steelers on the back of an improbable, really physical beatdown at the hands of the Jacksonville Jaguars. You go back and you look at that game again, and Jacksonville on both lines of scrimmage was really physically dominant in a way that I don't think people were ready to see, especially against a team like Pittsburgh that usually carries that moniker itself, that usually shows up with the best of the best in those spots. We can debate, the back end skill on defense for the Steelers, but on both lines of scrimmage, they've got dogs. And for the New Orleans Saints, you only had your back broken on maybe one of the most impressive end-of-game plays that we've seen in the history of the playoffs. That's one that truly will probably stand the test of time. And so now when we get ready to talk about the future for both of these teams, as those questions tend to pop up, if teams that have aging quarterbacks, coaches that have been around the franchise for a long time, both of whom have Super Bowls on their resume, but not as much playoff success since, you can imagine the questions pop up, and spoiler alert for everyone, not ready to discuss is going to factor prominently in this. So I ask you, Sean Payton, what's the future look like with Drew Brees in this franchise?
Can you give us any insight on the process that we'll work with Drew going forward?
Not right now. So no. Politely. No.
Is there no question in your mind, though, that you want him back as a quarterback?
Like I just finished saying, I'll say it to you, no. We'll get to you when it's time, and I'm sure that we'll go through the process, but today's not the time.
First and last year on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app, be a little more careful in what you're responding to, because I believe the question was, is there no doubt in your mind you want Drew back? And he was addressing no to the initial question, but makes it sound a little dicey there. Now, Drew Brees came out and was very matter of fact in his statement the other day on his future with the Saints. He said, I'll be here as long as they'll have me, essentially putting the ball in their court on this one, which is the savvy veteran move in all of this. And in my heart of hearts, we've seen enough of these Drew Brees one-year contracts, and especially after this season, where now you've got the luxury of already having most of the key guys on your roster either paid up already, and now the Saints salary cap situation in recent years has been abysmal. You go back in the last 2-3 years and they've been one of the league leaders in dead cap money almost every year, with the failed signings of guys like Jr. Golic and situations like that they've had to turn loose. But this last year, especially because of their draft success, they're in a unique position to where I think they're going to be able to keep Drew around. Now, Drew has shown that he's not really the guy that's willing to take a lot of that hometown discount the way Tom Brady is over in New England, but I think having so much of their young skill on the roster locked in key positions on rookie contracts, I think you're going to be in a good position. I think we're going to see Drew Brees finish out his career in a Saints uniform. And I think the two of them together, Drew Brees and Sean Payton, are going to be allowed to ride off in the sunset. What gets interesting is Mike Tomlin and the Steelers now, who are going to answer a lot of those same questions. And as we've seen reports, and this was coming from Will Bronson over at CBS Sports, but there have been, after especially the end game scenario of the divisional round game against the Jaguars, Mike Florio of Pro Football Talk reported that he's hearing some of the team's limited partners intend to lobby owner Art Rooney to fire Tomlin and hire a new coach. Now, Mike Tomlin was asked if he was ready to talk about possible changes to the coaching staff, and you can guess what the response was.
I don't know where these roads are going to lead. Some conversations need to be had. Some contracts are up, some contracts aren't. I'm not ready to discuss that at this point. Part of that, gaining that understanding, is those conversations and so forth. So you'll hear about them as they unfold, I'm sure, if there's anything to be heard, but not there yet, no.
And this is one of those situations where, again, these are, minority owners in the team who don't have the power to hire and fire or anything like that. So this is just people expressing their wishes and desires coming off a game in a situation where, listen, you can look at the way that the Steelers operated when the game was on the line and not feel great about it, and some of this has come up with Mike Tomlin, and people look at the talent on this roster and just assume that it's almost criminal it hasn't succeeded at the top end level yet. Now, you look at the success and the amount of games Mike Tomlin's won even over the last stretch of years, and you say if the changes are going to come, it's not going to be him right now. At a place that loves to have continuity at that position, kind of like the Cincinnati Bengals, but with much more success, this seems like an offseason where Todd Haley is going to be the victim. 2000 has been there since 2012. You look at an offense that has as many weapons as it does, who's going to have some questions to answer with Le'Veon. And again, never one to campaign for this, but when you look at easy scapegoats, it has Todd Haley written all over it, which is unfortunate for a guy that's been part of that great offense.
First and last, the podcast. First and last, the podcast.
Thought we'd be remiss if we didn't extend some certainly thoughts and prayers to the family, friends, and the Washington State football community as they mourn the loss of Tyler Hilinski, quarterback who was found dead last night, a self-inflicted gunshot wound, a suicide that is in every sense tragic, the way it always is. And, the further I've gotten away from playing, the more and more of what I appreciate about sports is that it's a relatable lens to discuss pretty universal issues. And this is one of them. And this is a tragedy that occurs far too often, and something that, as a colleague of ours here at ESPN, Adam Rittenberg, wrote about a while back concerning Isaiah Woods at Washington, a piece that I actually retweeted. If you get a chance, it just, a reminder that this isn't something anyone's going through alone. You're not the only one dealing with this. As Adam wrote in this piece, mental health is an issue that a lot of college athletes face, whether it's the stress, whether it's being away from home. And so as we certainly mourn and hurt for Tyler Hilinski and his family and the Washington State community and everyone on that team who, lost a brother and a son and a teammate, you want to also remind everyone that if you need help, ask. And it can be hard sometimes. And so if it's a person that you care about and you see something that you're concerned about, we have the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That number is 1-800-273-8255. And again, it's one of those situations where if you feel compelled at all, speak up, because you never know the impact that it could have. So certainly, again, thoughts and prayers to Tyler Hilinski's family, to his friends, and to the people of the Washington State community that are certainly hurting badly this morning as they lost someone that they really care about. One of those, again, no easy transition in a moment, in a morning with a lot of hard news like this. This was one of the last things that happened last night before you went to bed. And as someone who's a former college athlete, it certainly hits home when it's someone that looks like you and is going through similar things. So again, you want to encourage everyone to love them up at this time when they're hurting the most, and to again reach out if you need help. So that is certainly what we'll try and drive home with that. First and last here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. Again, in the no easy transition phase as we move back into the world of the NFL, as we've got the conference championship weekend coming up. We've got the teams ready to square off that look a little bit unfamiliar, we'll say, compared to years past, where this time last year we're dealing with the Atlanta Falcons and their MVP quarterback, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Patriots, and the matchup that everyone, including the Steelers, was looking forward to coming up to this moment. And Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers. You may have heard of him. You may have heard of that franchise. And now this year we've got a new look team like the Jacksonville Jaguars that's here and unapologetic about the way that they got here. And when you look at that team and the matchup that they're facing against the traditional power in the New England Patriots, and a team that has been the dynasty of the 2000s and has been led by maybe the greatest quarterback that we've ever seen, it is the ultimate matchup of youth versus experience. And we heard from youth the other day as Jacksonville Jaguars star cornerback Jalen Ramsey unapologetically voiced his belief in this team's ability to go out and win a Super Bowl. Maybe used a few more four-letter words in there than I did just now, but we got to pay the bills around here, and the FCC doesn't think too kindly of that. Tom Brady joined Kirk and Callahan on WEEI the other day and responded to the way that New England is approaching their matchup with Jacksonville.
We're going to need everyone to play well. This is not a team where you can have any lapses. I think this team, that we're facing challenges you in every single play, every part of the field. They're explosive. They have 8 touchdowns on defense. I mean, that's pretty incredible in of itself. They had another one, against Ben this last weekend. I mean, these guys can play football. They play really well, and, we got our work cut out for us.
First and last on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app. Tom Brady, in the body of that interview, also addressed Jalen Ramsey's very outspoken nature and his trash talk, and gave the diplomatic answer that he's more worried about the great player that Jalen Ramsey is on the field. More concerned with that than anything he's going to say. Someone who was a little bit concerned with what Jalen Ramsey had to say was our own ESPN front office insider and Hall of Famer Bill Polian, who, we'll say, cautioned the young player about punching up at the mighty Patriots.
5 banners hanging in Gillette Stadium for a reason. And the reason is because they are the best coached, most professional, best prepared team in the playoffs year in and year out. The Patriots have an over 800 winning percentage in the playoffs in Foxborough. So if you're going into the Lions' den, it's a good idea not to poke him. He's dangerous enough as it is.
And you know what? Bill is, for the most part, right. It's the right way to look at things. Hell, as I always tell you guys, I struggle with the player and the person I was as a player and the person I am now sitting in this chair. Because as a player, I was a guy who was very aware of my own skill level and understood what it took for me to be successful. And as I will never forget his words as long as I live, Zach Strief, the longtime right tackle for the New Orleans Saints, once said, you don't get bonus points for blocking a guy when he's mad. And you don't get bonus points for trying to pick off Tom Brady when you've given him a little extra gas for a guy that really doesn't need it. But that being said, man, there is something endearing about a guy as wantonly disregarding of all of these norms as Jalen Ramsey is, and really as this Jacksonville defense is. We saw them as soon as they got microphones after that game against Pittsburgh, letting everyone who wanted it have it, letting the people who had disregarded and besmirched their starting quarterback in Blake Bortles, anyone who had doubted them was going to catch this heat because the Jacksonville Jaguars are emboldened by their own success and their belief in themselves and what they've done. And I'm not here to stifle that. Like, again, Bill is probably right. It's probably not going to help you, but at the same time, this team has gotten by, and the reason a team this young has been successful, and they've got veteran pieces. You've got Malik Jackson, who's won a Super Bowl. You've got Calais Campbell, who's been an All-Pro and a Pro Bowler in this league for a while now, to really steady that defense. Paul Posluszny's been an underrated force in that locker room. As this linebacker room has gotten younger and more athletic, he's still a guy that's been a fixture in that organization that can be that voice there. But the way Jacksonville's gotten by this season is on the strength of youth, not understanding what it doesn't know. And there is a beauty in that. And there's a beauty in this team just going full throttle in the way that, honestly, we saw a lot from a defense that this unit is beginning to remind people of in that Seattle Seahawks team that absolutely smacked around the Denver Broncos. That was, again, young, brash, and unapologetically who they were. And when you allow these guys, especially on the defensive side of the ball, where that can feed into success as much as anything else, to go out there, live your best life. And if that for Jalen Ramsey is going straight at the GOAT and Tom Brady, who am I to stop him? Because A, he's backed it up on the field so far, and B, it is sure as hell a lot more entertaining. As someone who lived through Super Bowl week with two really respectful teams in the Atlanta Falcons and the New England Patriots that weren't going to give you any bulletin board material, I don't know how we as football fans, again, we've got to do a good job rewarding stuff that should be exciting to us. You've got a team that's actually willing to step outside of the box of cliches and give you what they're really feeling. And they're really feeling that they're not scared of anyone. Not Tom Brady, not no Patriots logo on the side of the helmet, not Bill Belichick, not anyone. And hell, it kind of feels like something that we should smile at and maybe reward a little bit by understanding that there can be room for both. I will always, till the day I die, rebuke the idea that there is one way to win and there is one way to be great. Now, you can look at the ones that consistently work, and they all have a lot of things in common. But we've seen enough greatness pop up in areas with people who are willing to unapologetically be themselves that I think it's okay to embrace. This NFL is big enough and wide-ranging enough to have a little bit of both in there. And watching them go head-to-head this weekend is going to be damn fun.
First and last, the podcast.
And a very happy 96th birthday to one Betty White, the national treasure, the goddess herself. I want to put that out in the ether right now, because when you go on Twitter, you're going to see that Betty White is trending. And when we see Betty White is trending, we all get a little nervous. Because at this point, she has reached national treasure status. Like, she is in the Smithsonian. All that good stuff. So I just want to alert everyone, this is the good trending for Betty White. We can keep on keeping on. But, like, has there been a bigger rock star at 96? Like, you're going to have to find me someone who is doing 96 better than her, who is still that funny and engaged. Like, I'm not that funny now. So kudos to her and a very happy birthday. Go wish her a happy birthday on the 1-800-Flowers.com Twitter feed. Do something good with your day here. I promise it'll be worth it. Now, what we've got coming up later this month, we've had a lot of news in the NBA, a lot of fights, a lot of fisticuffs, a lot of breaching going on. But the other day, we got a little bit of what seemed like peace. I think we can call that brokering a peace in all of this. Now, it didn't come about easily. And what we're talking about here is in the NBA, Isaiah Thomas came out and tweeted the other night that while he appreciates what the Celtics' intention is and what they're trying to do with the video tribute that they had planned for him in the previous matchup with the Cavaliers, that he had asked because he wasn't playing to be moved to their February 11th matchup, that while he appreciated that sentiment, his quote was, "I'd like to thank the Celtics for their gracious offer to play a video tribute on February 11th celebrating my 3 years in Boston. But since it appears that this has caused some controversy with Paul Pierce's night, I'd like to ask the Celtics to instead focus all of their attention on number 34's career." So this seems like a good olive branch moment and a good admission by Isaiah Thomas that this isn't really worth the headache for him. Where it gets interesting for me is, and I understand it, and listen, Paul Pierce, you see him on the jump all the time with Rachel Nichols and company out there, does a great job for us covering the NBA, and is certainly a guy that by the nature of his tenure with the Boston Celtics is more than deserving of this. That has never been in question. But I've never really understood why there was the need to flex in this situation the way there was. And he's gotten support from almost everyone. And, Paul Pierce said himself that he talked to a number of people. He talked to people close to him to make sure that he was going about this the right way. And that everyone agreed. Tony Allen, who played along Pierce on the 2008 championship team, said, "I'm with Pierce, man. Thomas didn't put in more work than Paul." Anybody disagree? Okay, Paul Pierce put in big work. Why would they honor Thomas on the same day? And again, I'm not someone who's in line for any honor like this anytime soon, so maybe it's something I can't quite reconcile with. But when I look at something that would mean as much to me at a place that means as much to Paul Pierce as Boston does and the Celtics does, this seems like an area where flexing wasn't necessary. I don't think anyone's going to look at Isaiah Thomas and Paul Pierce and assume a comparable level of importance to this franchise. Like, this is one of those things that sort of smells like a hint of insecurity at someone who feels the need to come in and push out another guy who, in a much more limited time period, still gave a lot to this Celtics team and was something that mattered to them. I understand Isaiah Thomas maybe could have just had the video play the other time, him sort of putting them in that tough spot. Paul Pierce even said, Danny tried to sell it on me, but I told him he had a shot, Danny, and he punked you on it. He pretty much dictated everything. They let it happen because they felt sorry for how the trade to Cleveland went down. It's guilt. That's what it is. So Paul Pierce indicating the Danny Ainge and company really were only going through the motions on this the way they were because they felt guilty about letting Isaiah go the way that they did, because we remember during the course of the playoffs last year, for a guy that had already endeared himself to a fan base, what Isaiah Thomas overcame with everything that happened with his sister and her tragic death during the playoffs that Isaiah battled through, in addition to then playing through a hip injury that has impacted his career going forward into this season. Paul Pierce kind of calling it what he believes it is, which is that this is done out of guilt more than actual obligation or something that he's actually earned. And my point is, all right, if Isaiah Thomas is comparatively not this important, why are you treating it as such? Because it seems like there's an awful lot of care for a situation that doesn't exactly mean it. And again, this isn't a knock on Paul Pierce, who is getting his just doing all of this. It just seems like a situation that's had a lot more made of it than need be. The other interesting part of this to me, and we heard from Paul Pierce the other day talking about the Cleveland Cavaliers and what he believes the real issue with them is going forward this season.
I don't know. I think there's some questions there. I mean, with the way Boston looks, with the way Toronto looks, I mean, you really have to be concerned if you're the Cavs. I mean, I know they pressed the button a year ago. Lost one game on their way to the finals. So they are able to press the button once they get there. But they could be bored with the process. But I think there's some concern in there. If they don't get a top 3 seed and they have to see Boston and Toronto to get to the finals, they might be in trouble.
First and last, Mike Golic Jr. here on ESPN Radio and the ESPN app, weighing in as he's paid to do as an analyst. But the interesting part to me was always this: Isaiah Thomas has these 2 instances where he's coming to Boston to play with the Cleveland Cavaliers against this team. That's when he can get there, when this video tribute would have taken place. I don't know if Paul Pierce's work life dictates this or what it is schedule-wise. I'm sure he could get the days off from ESPN. But that February 11th date has been really drawn a hard line in the sand. Now, I understand a lot goes into the honoring and the things that go on, but is this really something that couldn't have been moved to another night, as you've got every Celtics home game as an option? Like, did Paul Pierce want LeBron James in the house for this? Is this a power play in that regard? I'm not really sure. I just never understood why this wasn't something that was even talked about. There was never even a hint that Paul Pierce could just celebrate this on another night, that would somehow dictate a comparative lesser amount of importance to that franchise that, again, was someone who we all acknowledge is an all-time Celtic the way Paul Pierce is. I didn't really ever think that was in question. But maybe I'm the crazy one in all this. So February 11th, that night is cleared out. He will get his shine, and Isaiah Thomas will bow out gracefully, and we probably won't talk about this anymore. We probably shouldn't, because it's not really all that big of a deal until it apparently became one.
Thank you for listening to the First and Last podcast. You can listen and subscribe to all ESPN podcasts in the Listen tab of the ESPN app. First and Last.